Hey everyone, welcome back. Welcome to part 2 of the video tutorial series where we will be covering front-end development in React. So let's get started. Make sure that you are on the root folder, which is the dev-workshop-public folder. That is your current directory. You can also say something like pwd, which basically prints the working directory. That is what the pwd is there for, to make sure that you are on this particular location. Awesome. So now what we're going to do is just say npx create -react -app, and then after a space, just give the name of the folder in which all your bootstrap React starter files will be set up inside. So I'm naming it client, and just press enter and it will make much more sense in just a second. So as you can see, it is creating a new React app inside this particular folder. So we have a client folder here up now, and our React app is being built inside that client folder. So while these packages are being installed and our environment for React is getting set up, let me quickly go to my browser and just show you some beautiful things about semantic UI React and how we can leverage that in our own projects. So just going to click here. This is one of the innumerable UI frameworks that are available out there for development purposes, and you can just directly use them and their styles to speed up your dev process. So let me show you a quick element right here. Let's look at the comment component inside views. Now if you look at these things, I think they're really beautiful, that they have done a really good job with the UI, and we can use these things directly in our own apps as well, because each message can be represented as a comment, if you see. The best part about this is that if you click on try it, then they provide you with the code itself that you can directly use inside your own apps, which, trust me, speeds up the development process by, I don't even know, it just speeds it up exponentially. So just let me quickly go back to our app, and yay, awesome. React was just installed, and if everything has gone correctly, then you should see this happy hacking message right over here. All right, so in order to just check out whether everything has installed correctly or not, if you cd inside your client folder or whatever you chose to call your folder, and then just do an npm start real quick, then you should see, just wait for it, just hit OK to allow VS Code to open up Chrome. And if you see, this is what I was talking about. It is now trying to open up the React dev environment on localhost 3000. And yes, if everything went correctly, then you should see this beautiful, awesome kind of a logo spinning up. And they are telling us as well, just edit the app.js file and save it and reload the file to see what changes have been made. So just to cover some basics, first of all, let me quickly open up another terminal. The way you can do that is just press the plus button here, and you can choose between these two. I'm going to go back to the first one. Now we are actually running an app on localhost 3000, just like we were running the server on localhost 8080. So let me go inside the client folder. You can see there are a bunch of files over here. Don't worry about them. Don't let them overwhelm you. Just go inside the source folder, and let me just quickly open up app.js. If you see, the thing that we're seeing on the screen right now is basically written here itself. You see that we have the edit source app.js and save to reload, and we can see that on the browser itself as well. What this means is that if I do something like just remove this line or something like that, and just save it. I want to save on. Then you see that it tried to recompile it. And if I now go back to the screen, we don't have that message anymore. So this is pretty awesome. We can just make any changes, save the file, and without having to hit refresh or do anything, those changes will be reflected on the browser itself. So first things first, we are going to remove a lot of things that we don't need. So all I want you to do is remove all the content inside this outer level div with the class name app. Class name is basically shorthand for class. We can target similar elements by tagging them with class, and we can then style elements of a particular class. And all this will make a lot more sense moving on in the project. So let me just quickly remove all this code that lives between here. And now we see some kind of warnings. For example, for one, we see that logo is defined but is never used because we just deleted that file. So we can delete this particular line of code as well. And I would argue that we can also delete app.css as well. So all you should have is this. We are seeing a function notation here right now. They have, I think, updated it. We can change it to something else as well. So let me change this to class notation. So what I want to do is just to remove this function keyword and just say class app, and I'm going to remove these params as well. What I want you to do is introduce a new function called render, and we are going to override that function, and I'm just going to move this entire return statement. I'm just going to cut this return statement just like that. I'm just going to cut this, and I'm going to add this inside my render function just like that. So one other thing we can do is we can also import component from React, and our class app can extend that component. I also do not like the spacing, so let me just change the indentation to tabs real quick. Awesome. So now the indentation is changed to tabs. I don't know, I just have a thing for tabs. And that's that. So if I just add a message like hello world inside this div, and it's auto saving, and if I go back to my browser, then you can see this hello world right over here. And that's that. It's as simple as that. So anything inside the render function, we need to have a return statement, and inside the return statement within the params, we can have all the HTML that we want to render on the page itself. One thing to note over here is that this return function can only have one root element inside which we can have different elements. And what I mean when I say that is I cannot have something like this, because then it will throw an error. It will say all JSX, and this is what is meant by JSX. It is basically HTML combined with JavaScript. That is what is meant by JSX. All JSX elements must be wrapped inside an enclosing tag, and that should be one enclosing tag. So I cannot have something like class name. Let's give it a class name of test, something like this, with two independent elements which are not wrapped inside one tag. What I can in fact do is if I just cut this, I can paste it inside that div itself, and then everything should work fine. So that's just one thing to keep note of. The other thing that I want you to know is all components have a constructor which we can define as well. Every constructor should take in this field called props, and once we do that, we need to call the superclass with the props keyword as well. This is kind of a mechanical step, just bear with me and everything should make more sense. We do get a warning which says that it's a useless constructor. These warnings are pretty, I don't know, honest, I would say, which I kind of like, because a constructor is only required when a component, and things like these are called components. For example, app in this case, which is our component, needs to maintain some kind of a state. So for example, if you're coming from a Java world, then the class fields that we have, they only make sense if those fields are required in the first place. That is what the constructor is there for. That is what the constructor initializes. It initializes the fields with some values, right? So what I can say is, in React, when we want to do something like that, we just say this dot state, and do you see this keyword? It again refers to the context of this particular component, which in this case is the app. You can say this dot state, and this is basically an object in which we can say, for example, something like name, and I for now can just say Alice or something like that. We can basically assign any kind of value to this particular state. So what we are trying to say with this line is that there is a state called name which has a value Alice. The way we can use values from the state is pretty simple. We can basically say, if you were thinking we can say this dot state dot name, you were absolutely right. The only issue is that once we try to render this kind of a thing, and if I'll just show it to you on the browser, then we just see this dot state dot name on the browser. And that is because everything inside this return statement is rendered or is interpreted as HTML. So the way we can use or render JavaScript inside HTML is just by enclosing any kind of JavaScript within these curly braces. And now we should be able to see the name Alice right over here. So it's as simple as that. We can have any kind of state and we can use the value of state inside our app. Now, before we go any forward, what I would like to do is delete some unnecessary files. So we don't need app.css, so you can just go ahead and delete that file. We don't need app.test.js, so I'm going to delete that file. We don't need logo.svg, and that's the last file that we don't need, and I will just go ahead and delete that file. So all this is nice, this is really cool. So the way I like to architect my React apps is just by specifying folders, because if you see, we have a lot of components and we can think of this browser window as our page, and every page is composed of components. So for example, if we are building our chat app, then I would argue that we should have a chat page as well, which will be built up or which will be composed of components, right? So what I'm going to do is just define a folder or make a new folder inside my source folder right over here. So I'm just going to right click src and I'm just going to say new folder, and I'm going to name it chat, and that's it. Now inside the chat folder, I'm going to make a new file. Just right click chat folder and press new file, and I'm going to call it chat page.js. Awesome, and it gives us an empty file. This is going to be a React file. So in order to start off with any React files, what we need is an import statement, and what we are importing is import React and component from React. And just try to read these as English phrases, they make a lot more sense, trust me. Now I'm going to define a class called chat page, which extends component. And this line of code, you should get used to this line of code, just because as and when we write more components, like these kind of lines will be like, we will be writing a lot of these kinds of lines. And for now, we can just have a render method inside here, inside chat page. And inside the render method, we need a return statement, which will return some kind of JSX or the thing that we want to display on the page. So let me just return a div, and inside the div, I'm just going to say chat page. So now we have defined a chat page. We have defined a chat page, but we cannot use it inside app. Just think of app as a big container inside which you want to display all your pages. So in order to do that, we would need to like display the chat page somewhere here. But the issue is that we are not exporting anything from chat page yet. So the way we can export is just by saying export default, and that's an important keyword, just remember that. Export default chat page. And what that means is we are now exporting this class that we have just defined. Now that we have exported this out, if we go back to app.js, we can import that class in just by saying import chat page, which is the name of the class we are exporting from, and within quotes, I'm going to define the location of that particular entity that I want to use inside app. So dot and / refers to the current directory we are in. So we are inside the source directory, and inside source we want to go to the chat folder. So VS Code is smart enough to see that we have a chat folder, and inside chat we have a chat page.js file that we want to import. So if I just press /, we see the chat page. And we don't need to add the .js extension after it. You can if you want to, but React is smart enough to understand that it's a JS file. And now, instead of just showing this .state.name, let me quickly remove this. And within tags, what I can say is chat page. And this is a self-closing tag. So let me just do this. And that's it. We are now successfully rendering whatever chat page has to offer inside app.js. So if I go to my browser, I can see chat page. And this is something that we have defined in here. Awesome. So we probably don't need a constructor inside app just yet. There is one more concept that I would like to clear right now, and that is the concept of props in React. And it will make a lot more sense if I just show you a quick example. For example, if I want to show the name Alice that I was showing before inside chat page, or if I want to like pass in some information from app to chat page, I can do that using props. So for example, if I want to show some name that was defined inside the app component, let me just quickly define a constructor and it will make a lot more sense. So constructor takes in props, and as soon as we do that, we need to call super with the field or with the argument props. This is a pretty mechanical step. Let's just quickly define state and say this dot state is equal to, and I'm just going to provide a quick name property with the name Alice. Now let's suppose we want to pass this particular field Alice, or the name field, to our chat page component. The way we can do that is we can name our prop. Now this is a prop, and we can pass some value by saying name is equal to this dot state dot name. So again, this can be anything. Like this need not be called name. We can actually just refer to it as n or something, or x or something. So now x is the name of a prop which has the value this.state.name. So instead of showing chat page, if I wanted to show the prop x here, what I can say is, and remember, because it is JavaScript code, it needs to be inside curly braces. What I can say is this.props.x. And if I just save this and go back to the browser, then we can see the name Alice over here. So it's pretty simple. We just have this.state.name and we are just passing it as a prop, and we call that prop x. And the way we can use that prop inside chat page is just by stating this.props.x. You can pass in functions as well. Now let's pass in a function, and we can just say handle click. Let's call it handle click for now. And I'm just going to make it an arrow function. And arrow functions are pretty awesome in React because they automatically bind this function to the context of this component. So you can read a little bit more on that, but in short, just use arrow functions when you're writing code in React. Now, in order to set the behavior for this function, what I wanted to do is that it should set the state, and there is an inbuilt method called setState, which gets fired. And I want to set the state. If you see, we have a name field, right? I want to change that name field. So what I can do is I can just say name, and I can change the value of name from Alice to Bob. That is what I wanted to do as soon as this function is called. So just to show you how this thing will work is that if I go back to the page right now, we see the name Alice because the function has not been called yet. But if I call the function inside the render method, if I call this.handleClick just like that, then if we go back, we landed in an infinite loop. All right. The important thing to remember about this set state is that whenever state changes in React, whenever this thing will change for this particular component, this entire component will render again. Like this method will render again because something has changed inside that field. So if, just to show you an example, what I can do is I can also pass in another prop, and I can literally call that prop. I can name it anything. I'm just calling it handleClick because it's logical to call it handleClick and it makes naming more consistent and easier to remember. I'm just going to say handleClick, and within curly braces, I'm going to pass in this.handleClick function. Remember that I'm not calling the function here. This, if I add the params, that means I would call the function right over there, which does not make a lot of sense. I can just pass in the prop. I can just pass in the reference to that function. And this means that handleClick now has the value of this function. I'm basically passing this function down to chat page. On chat page, what I can do is that inside this div, there is an inbuilt function called onClick. Remember, this is not a prop. This is an inbuilt function. What I can set some behavior of it. So what I want when someone clicks on that div is basically what I can define within these params. On click, what I want is I want to call this dot props dot handle click. Again, don't do this because this will actually call the function. This function will automatically be called once the user clicks on this particular thing. So what basically is happening is that I have passed down a function called handleClick, which changes the state of the app component inside chat page when I click some element inside chat page. So if I go back to my browser and if I just click on Alice real quick, you see it changed to Bob. So as soon as I clicked on the div, the onClick method was fired, which called the handle click method, passed in through the props, and the handle click method basically refers to this method down here, and it just changes the state. That is all that it does. So that was a little bit about props and state. Let me just quickly remove these things because we don't need them now. But I hope that the concept of props and state is clear now. So now, let me just clear this up real quick. We don't need this. We don't even need the constructor. And we can remove this because this is not defined anymore inside chat page. So I'm just going to remove this. Beautiful. So we now have cleaned it up. Really nice. So inside our chat page, we are going to now use some semantic magic. So I'm just quickly going to go to my other terminal screen. If you don't see another one like I'm seeing in the dropdown now, you can just click on the plus button and it will open up a new one. So I'm just going to my terminal screen. Right now I'm in the dev workshop public folder. I'm going to cd into the client folder, and this is important. Make sure that you are inside the client folder. And now I'm going to install two more packages. The first one is npm install, and I'm going to save it as well using the -- save flag. And the package is called semantic -ui -react. And let's just quickly wait for that package to be installed. The way most of UI frameworks work is that they basically, you don't need to worry about these warnings, that they basically divide the browser screen up into rows, horizontal rows, and vertical columns, which allows us to space things out. I think Bootstrap divides the screen up in 12 columns, and I think Semantic divides the screen up in 16 columns. You can just look up the documentation if the information that I'm providing is not accurate. But yeah, that is how most of these frameworks work. Let us quickly install one more package, which is npm install, and we are going to save that one as well. -- save semantic -ui -css. And this should be quicker than the first package. Let's just wait while it installs. And those rows and columns basically provide us with a kind of a grid, which makes it pretty systematic to actually place our UI elements. And all this will make a lot more sense once we get to the code. Beautiful. So now that is done. Just a quick mechanical step. I want you to find the index.js file, which should be inside the src folder, and quickly open that up. Inside the index.js file, we are going to, right below this, we are going to import the semantic UI CSS file that we have just installed. So I'm just going to say import semantic UI, and you can see semantic -ui -css / semantic.min.css. So we are just importing the CSS files in our index.js file. That's it. I'll just save that, and I'm just now going to close index.js. This was done in order to make sure that our styles actually show up in a semantic way. So just to give you a quick example of how we can use components from semantic UI, let me just quickly import a button. Make sure that it's inside the curly braces from semantic-UI-react this time around. Make sure that you're on chatpage.js, and now we can just use button right in here. Let me quickly go back up here, and if I open up my browser now, we can see a button has appeared up here. We can provide it with some content as well, and you can see that we have now a click me button, and this already comes with some default styling, as you can see here. In fact, just to show you, we can also say something like primary, and let me just save that file. And now if we go back to browser, you can see that primary is basically a keyword. That is, you can basically check out the documentation from here. Primary is a keyword that we can use to define some styling on this particular button. Awesome. So this means that semantic is up and running now. We don't need the button as such for now. Instead, what we are going to do is going to focus on the grid aspect of semantic UI. So instead of importing button, what we're going to do is import a grid from semantic UI, and we're just going to remove this line of code. In fact, we don't even need these divs now. We can just say grid, and let me just quickly close that tag up as well. Really good practice to just keep on closing your tags. Inside the grid, we have got 16 columns, right? So I'm just going to say grid dot column, and we can set a property called width, and we can specify the number of columns that this particular element takes. So this basically means that this particular tag is taking up 4 columns, inside the overall grid, which spans the width of the browser. So I'm just going to quickly copy and paste that 2 more times. In totality, we need to have 3 tags. And I'm going to change this this adds up to 12 right now, but we have got 16 columns. So let me just change the center one to 8, and now this adds up to 16. Now let me show you what I mean by that. If I change it from a self-closing tag to a regular closing tag, and if I let me just add some quick content inside here. Let me just say center area, and let's just quickly let it save it up. And if I go back to the browser now, if everything should be working right now. And right here we have got the center area. So if you can see, then we have got some padding right over here and some padding right over here, although like this is hard to see. So let me quickly, if you go to the Chrome DevTools, and you can just go to the DevTools by right clicking, and if you right click and just press inspect, then that will open up the DevTools. And I'm just going to select on this option right over here. Let me just shrink this a little bit. And this is one of the most beautiful tools for any kind of web developer. So if I just click on this option, this will help us to just hover over elements and inspect them. So this is the entire body that we have. If I just hover over this, then this is the area which is taking up 8 columns. This is the area which is taking up 4 columns, and this is the area which is taking up 4 columns as well. So we have got this nice center area where we will basically be basing our entire app, which is centrally aligned, because there are 4 columns here and there are 4 columns here. And this is responsive as well, so regardless of whether I just shrink down this screen, just like you can shrink down the screen just by clicking on this as well. This will let you like play around with different sizes. Great for development, especially for front-end development. You can check your UI out and how it acts on mobile, tablet, and laptops. For example, if I click on this, and it will show me how it will act on mobile. And if I again hover over it, then again it's centrally aligned. We have got 4 columns here, 8 columns here, and 4 columns here. So it's irrespective of the size. If I want to see how it would look in an iPhone X, I can just say iPhone X, and this is what it will look like. On an iPad, it will look something like this. As you can see, the area increases proportionately, so that's awesome because that is what you want. But for now, I think just a regular laptop is fine. This is how it looks on a laptop. So beautiful. Now we have got some area to play around with, and we have got it nice and centered between 4 columns on the right and 4 columns on the left. Alright, so let's go back to the code. So this is the area where we will be adding most of our logic in. The way I'm imagining the app is that inside the center area, at least 75 or 3/4 of the screen will be allocated to what the previous messages are. So that's for listing all the previous messages, 3/4 of the screen. And the bottom 1/4 of the screen will be used to actually give input options or input tags where users can enter their name and their message to post the message itself. So those are 2 big components that I'm thinking about. One is the messages container component, and the other is the inputs component, where basically the user can input their name and message to post data to our DB itself. So with that in mind, what we can do is we can say that this particular grid column which is 8 columns wide is going to have 2 areas, right? One is going to be, so what we can do is it's going to have 2 rows if you think about it. So one is going to be grid dot, let's just quickly add those, grid dot row. That adds 1 row, and I'll just say row 1, or I'll just call it messages container, and I'll just copy paste this code right over here, and I will call this thing the input container. And let's see what it looks like on the screen right now. Beautiful. So now we have a messages container, which is 1 row, and we have an inputs container, which is another row. But right now these 2 things are pretty close to each other, and like the messages container is not taking up 3/4 of the screen or something like that. So it's an easy fix. What we can do is we can go back to VS Code, and we can provide some styling to the messages container itself. So what I can say here is I can define independent CSS files for all components. So inside the chat folder, if you right click, just right click the chat folder and say new file, select new file. And I'm just going to make a new file called chatpage.css. And this is basically a style sheet that can be used to style our components. CSS stands for cascading style sheets, and it's pretty easy. And it's the best way to learn it is just like get right into it. So let me just quickly show it to you. Before I write down any rules, let me quickly import. And again, we are on the same level. and I'm just going to say chat page.css. So we're basically importing the style sheet into our component itself. Now let me tag this particular row, the messages container row, with a class, and I'm just going to say class name is equal to, within string, I'm just going to say messages container. Now if you go to your style sheet, the way you can target certain classes is just using the dot operator, and what we called it inside chatpage.js was messages container, and now we can define some rules, style rules for the elements inside that class. So what I just want to do is I just want to assign it a height of 75 VH, and this basically means 75% of view height. That is what the view VNH are there for. So let me just save this up, and let's go back to the browser and let's quickly see what we have. And beautiful. Now, if I just quickly hover over the elements, we have a messages container which is taking up 3/4 of the screen, and we have an input container which is taking up the remaining amount of screen. Well, it's not taking up the remaining amount of screen, but it will take up the size, or the height of this container is going to be defined by the elements that are inside that container. I would actually argue that we can change the height from 75 VH to 80 VH just because. And let me just quickly save that and let that refresh, and there you can see that it actually moved down, and now we have a messages container that is taking up 80% of the view height, and the remaining is, well, not the remaining, but just below that we have got the input container, and that's good because that is exactly what we want. So cool. Now what we can do is, if you have a messages container that we have right here, then if I think about this thing in React terms, I would say that you should make a component for this. And the way we can make a component for this is pretty simple. We just go over the same steps. Inside your chat folder, we will make a new file. So just right click on the chat folder and say new file. And we're going to call that file messages container.js. As simple as that. We're just going to import React. Again, this is a very mechanical step. And component within curly braces from React. We're going to say class messages container extends component. This is going to have a really nice and easy render method which has a return statement. And all we will return for now is a div which says messages container, and let us quickly export the default messages container. And now because we have exported it, we can import it. Let me actually import it right before the CSS file. Import the messages container from, we are on the same level, and VS Code is smart enough to recognize it, messages container. And instead of having this message right over here, we can just have a tag called messages container, and it's a self-closing tag for now. And if everything worked correctly, then if I go back to the browser, it should still be the same. Awesome. So it's still the same. Similarly, if I go back to VS Code now, I can make another file for the input container. So right click on chat, new file. I'm going to call it input container.js. Again, import React and component from React, class input container extends component. This is again going to have a very simple render method with a simple return statement. It's just a div which says input container, and we're just going to export the default input container. And now that we have exported it, we can import it inside our chat page.js file. So just like we imported messages container, I'm going to import input container from, again, the same level, input container. And instead of having this right here, what we can do is we can just say input container, and it's a self-closing tag for now, and that's it. And if I go back to the browser now, let it refresh, and there we have it. We still have the same things, but now our code is nice and modular. We have separate files for separate concerns, and that is the way code should be written. That is the way good code should be written. Beautiful. So now that we have that, what we can do now is basically let's focus on the input container. So let me open up the input container file, and let's go back to semantic UI. And if I go to the form section in collections, then we can see a bunch of code that is already written. So what I'm imagining is that we would want 2 input tags, basically, which are text tags, so that the user can input their name and their message in. So if I just quickly click on try it, then you can see that they have already provided us with the code that we would basically need to run this file. And that is beautiful because we don't need to worry about a lot of things now. So what we can say right here is we can go back to code and let's import form, and the other thing we would need is input and a button to actually submit stuff from semantic-UI-React. Nothing fancy yet. This is all we are doing. We have just imported a form, input and button elements from semantic UI React file. Awesome. So now that we have that, let me just quickly check the documentation again. So now what we can do is we can just remove this particular div. All we need is a form element. Inside the form element, what we need are the input fields, right? So what we can say is we need a form dot input field, and we can assign a placeholder value to it as well, and our placeholder value in this case could just be name. I'm just going to copy this line and I'm just going to paste it right below it, and I'm going to change this value to type your message here. And that's that. And let me quickly go back to the browser to check what we have right now. Let me refresh the page. Beautiful. So if you can see, we have a name input field and a message input field right over here. Let's quickly add a button as well. So button, and that button will say send, because we want to send the message. Once that is done, and I'm also going to make these two fields required, and all you need to do to say it's a required field is just literally have the word required over there. It's as simple as that. So what this means is if a user tries to press enter without filling these two fields up, it won't work, and we want that because we don't want to provide our database with fields that don't have either name or the message or both on pressing send. So that is that. The other thing we can do is assign state to this component, and what I'm doing will make a lot more sense once I actually type out the code. So just follow along. We're going to make a constructor, and all React constructor take in props. Inside the constructor, we are going to call the super class with props as well, and we're going to assign some state. So I'm going to say this dot state is equal to, and it's an object. I'm going to say name. The initial value for name should be an empty string. This is the name of the sender, right? I can also call it sender. That makes more sense because it matches the name on our DB as well. And then I'm going to say content, and this is the content of the message. And again, this should be an empty string as well. It is as simple as that. So now what I can do is I can have another attribute over here called value. And again, it's important to know that these things are not props per se, because these are keywords. And I'm going to say value within params. I'm going to say this dot state dot name, and here I'm going to say value is equal to this dot state dot content, and just a second, this should be sender and that should be content. Now the thing is, okay, we can also remove this because we're using form.input. That's nice. If I go back to the browser now, and if I just let me deselect this, let me refresh the page. Now if I try to type in a name, I'm actually typing in something, I promise you, but it's not showing anything. Yeah, and same goes for the message field. I cannot see anything that I'm typing inside the input. And the reason for that is pretty simple, because we have bound the value for this to the state, which is an empty string. So regardless of whether I type it or not, the value is always going to remain the same. But we want something to happen on change, right? And the keyword here to notice is on change. So what I'm going to do is, just to make it a little more readable, I'm going to put this on separate lines. And this is not changing the functionality in any way. I'm just making it more readable. I'm going to do the same for this one. The keyword to notice there was on change. So right here, I'm going to add a thing called on change. And again, this is a reserved keyword, and that is why VS Code was able to pick it up. And this is a callback function that is fired when something changes inside that field. And the way JavaScript works is that when something changes, an event is triggered. This will make a lot more sense once I actually do it. So this is actually a callback function which takes in one argument, namely the event. As you can see, E, if you saw it right there. We can call it E. You can call it anything, like we can call it event as well. Or I think event might be a reserved keyword. So calling it E is good. Let's just quickly check. Yeah, you can call it event as well. So you can call it E, and what you want to do is, once you get that E, you want to set the state, and set state is a function which takes in an object as an argument, and you want to change the sender field to E dot target dot value. Okay, so let's take a step back and let's actually understand what it means. When this function is fired, an event is triggered, and the value, in this case the actual key that we press on the keyboard, that is the value, is stored inside e.target value. e.target.value. All we want to do is we want to set the state so that the sender now has this value. This value gets appended on it. So if I go back to my browser now, and if I hit refresh, and if I now try to type in my name, let's say Alice or Zubin or anything, we can now see something in the fields. But we don't see it when I try to do it for the message field. So in order to change that for the message field, we are going to do the same thing. I'm going to add an onChange attribute, and within curly braces, I'm going to define a callback function which takes in one argument, which is the event argument. And now all I'm going to do is I'm going to set the state so that content now has the value of e.target.value. Feel free to pause and rewind, because this might not be the most instinctive thing. I do understand, even I had my issues wrapping my head around this. So feel free to just absorb this in. So that is that. And if I go back to my browser now, I should be able to say Zubin, and I should be able to type in my messages as well. I could say hey there or something like that. Now, if I go back to code, we want something to happen when the user presses the send button itself, right? So there is a property called onSubmit, and we can say onSubmit is equal to this. Let me just quickly check that. So we can set the type of this button to submit, and on the form we can have an onSubmit function. So let's just make an onSubmit function. We can say onSubmit. Again, this is a reserved keyword, and it's a callback function that gets fired when the user tries to press enter or tries to submit it using the button. These two things get linked, and we can just say this dot handle submit. But the issue is, and again, I'm not calling the function here, I'm just providing a reference to the function. The thing to note here is handle submit is not a function yet. So let's just quickly define the function handle submit. I'm just going to say handle submit is equal to, again using arrow functions for the automatic binding. And for now, let's just log out the values of the sender and the content of the message. So I'm just going to say this dot state dot sender, and I'm just going to log out this dot state dot content, and let's just see what happens. Content, we're missing an M. Let's save it up. Let's go back to the browser. Let's open up a React app. Quickly hit refresh and let me open up console. Now let me type in my name, Zubin, and let's just type in some message, hey there, and let's press send. Now if you see, we are getting the name of the sender and the content of the message in our console. If I try to send it without having anything here, it will show an error and it will ask me to fill out this field, and it won't let me submit it till the time I fill out this field. And that is because of the required keyword that we had in there. Great, that's working fine. Let me just, yeah. Now, let me just do it once again, and there is an issue that I notice here. If I press send, although I'm getting the message and the name of the sender right here, this thing is not clearing out, and that is easily fixable. If I go back to the code, what I want it to happen is that I want to set the state so that name again becomes an empty string, or sorry, the sender field again becomes an empty string, and the content also becomes an empty string. So now if I go back to my React app, and if I just say Zubin, and if I just say hey there, and if I press send, we get the values over here, and our fields also get refreshed in some way. That's great. That is exactly what we wanted. Beautiful. So this is that. Let's go back to the code, and let's now try to integrate some of our APIs in. We don't need these console.log statements inside our input containers handle submit function, so we can remove these. This is pretty much done. So now what we can do is we can load our previous messages in, and the way we can do that is by basically going onto chat page, and there is a method called component did mount, and this is a React lifecycle method, and I really encourage you to read more about React lifecycle methods. But essentially what it means is that this is a method that gets triggered on its own as soon as the components get mounted on the screen, and that is pretty self-explanatory from the name itself. As it says, if I hover over it, it is immediately called after the component is mounted. Setting the state here will trigger re-rendering. What this means is that typically we will always try to make our API calls inside this method so that we can set some state and change the UI, because setting the state always re-renders the app itself. As soon as we call the API, we can change the state so that the UI itself re-renders. So inside our component did mount function, what we can do is we can make a fetch request, and the fetch request is basically to our API itself. What we can do is we can just say we just need to provide the location. So the API would be available on http:// localhost on port 8080 this time around /API/message. But before we do any of that, let's open up a new terminal screen by pressing the plus button. Make sure that you're in dev-workshop-public. cd into the server folder and just say node space server.js to make sure that your server is actually up and running. Great. Now you can go back to your React window on your terminal. Going back to the fetch request, the first argument that it takes is the location. or the URL of the API itself, the endpoint. And the next argument that it takes is actually an object in which I can specify things like method. And in this case, I just want to get the messages. So what will this do is, if I quickly go to my server.js file right over here, we are basically trying to call this message, this particular API, this particular function. This will get triggered because it's a GET request that we're responding to, and it's available on /API/message. So I'll just close this. And if you look at chatpage.js, we are basically fetching some kind of messages. We're trying to get back the messages that were already posted. So this is basically to get back the chat history that is there. What we can do is, before we do anything else, we can make a constructor. And with constructors, we need to pass in props, and we call super with props as well. And we are going to set state as well. So we're going to say this dot state is equal to, and inside state, we're going to have messages. And initially, messages is going to be an empty list. And that makes sense as well because nothing has happened yet, right? But once the fetch request has been made, what we want to do is, I'm going to say it returns a promise. And the way promises work is that we can capture promises with then. When this thing is done, when that call is executed, then we can pass in a callback function with the response. But the thing is that we are getting back the response as a raw string. So what we want to do is we want to process that response and return it as JSON. So I'm just going to say response.json, and this will return the JSON version of the response. Then what we want to do is, with the JSON version of the response, res.json, we will again define a callback function. The thing about callback function is that I can put this inside params, but if it's only one argument, then you don't need the params to wrap it up. But let me just wrap it up in params. And once we have the JSON version of the response, what we can do is we can update the state, and we can just say this dot set state. And again, that takes in an object, and we can set the messages to the JSON version of the messages that we're getting back. And if by chance we face any errors on the way, we can capture that error as ERR, and we can define a callback function, and we can just log that error out. So let's just quickly go back to the browser and see if everything is working or not. Let me refresh the page. Alright, I'm not seeing any errors on the console, but to see whether we are getting back the messages or not, what we're going to do is we are just going to pass the messages now. Right now is a really good time to explain ternary operators as well. And ternary operators are nothing but fancy ways to write if conditions. So let me just write the statement and I'll explain to you what it means. So within curly braces, because we are writing JavaScript, this dot state dot messages dot length is greater than 0. Then what I want to do is return this, else I want to return an empty div. So what this ternary operator basically means is that if the length of messages is greater than 0, then this question mark means that this statement will be executed if this thing is true. So if the length of messages is greater than 0, then I want to render the messages container, else, which basically means after the semicolon, I just want to return an empty div. So inside the messages container, what I can do is I can just have a prop called messages, And to that I can pass the value of this dot state dot messages. And just to check whether we are getting the value inside a messages container, what I'm going to do is inside the render function, before returning anything, I'm just going to log out this dot props dot messages. And if I go back to the browser, let's see what we get on console. We are getting back a list of 9 messages. And if I open that up, these are all the 9 messages that were sent. And that's amazing because that is exactly what we need. All right. So now that that is done, I can remove this thing. Now let's start styling things up. So for that, what we can do is, let's go back to Semantic UI. Let's open up their comment section and let's just try it. So as you can see, they're using something called comment group and comment. So we can do the exact same thing. What we're going to do is we can just import comment. So inside here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to import comment from semantic-ui-react. And instead of returning this div, what we can do is we can return comment.group. So this will be a group of comments. And now this is a map function. A map, I'm going to use something called a map function over the list of messages that we're getting back, and this will make sense in just a few seconds. So this dot props dot messages, and we want to map over it, which basically is a fancy way of saying we want to loop over it. And the way it works is it basically takes in a callback function and it gives us a message to play around with. So if I were to read this, I can just say for every message inside messages, I want to do something. It is as simple as that. It's just a fancy way of writing a for loop. So for every message inside it's just a fancy way of writing a for loop. So what I want to do is that for every message inside messages, I want to return a message, right? So what I can do is I can just say return, and if I go back to semantic, I can just say comment, and inside comment I'm going to set 2 fields for now. Comment dot author and comment dot text. I'm just going to add a field called as b, and this basically means it will bolden the text up. And within these tags, the value that I wanted to have is, I'm going to use params here. I'm going to say message dot sender, because that will be the author, and the text will basically be message dot content. I can close this up as well. This is message to the message, and if I go back to my browser now, and beautiful, we have a list of all the messages that were sent before. We are getting it's an error which actually does not affect your UI, but it's good to address this. So every child should have a unique key prop. So that is arising from the map function. So what we can do to amend that is, it also returns another thing, which is the index. And just to make it unique, the index is always going to be unique. So I can add a key element over here, again using the curly braces, and I'm just going to say C plus index. So it's going to be like C0, C1. That is what the keys are going to look like. And if I go back to my browser now, then we shouldn't see any errors now. There's just one more thing that I would like to add. There are actually a couple of things that we can do. We can make this entire thing into its own separate component. It may seem as overkill for now, but you can definitely do that. And then you would just need to like pass in these two values, or the message value itself, and it should just work. But this also works for now. It's really not that big a problem. If you go back to chat page, you remember this class name that we gave, messages container? So you're just going to do something with that. Just open up chatpage.css, and just beneath height, what we're going to do is we're going to add an overflow property, and we're going to add overflow dash, wait a second, it's going to be overflow dash y, so it's in the y axis, and I'm just going to say scroll. So whenever it becomes more than 80 VH, the overflow will become scroll. So that means when these messages get out of hand, we will have a scroll bar over here, right over here. And that's pretty neat. We will need that. All right, so now we have defined some logic for getting messages. Now let's define some logic for actually posting messages. So we can close chatpage.css. We can close messages container because we are done with that. Now we need to worry about the input container. All right. So what we can do for input container is, we need to define something for this handle submit button, right? Something needs to happen when this thing happens. Always try to like define your fetch requests, and a fetch request can totally be a post request as well, inside the overall container. So chat page is the overall container for both input container and messages container, so that we can like play around with the data over there. So let me define a function called handle submit over here. And what we will do is we will basically pass that function down as a prop to our input container. So what I'm going to say is handle submit, and again I'm going to use arrow functions. And this function which we're defining is going to take in two parameters, which are basically the sender and the content of the message. And what this function is going to do is basically make a fetch request. A fetch request again takes two arguments. The first one is the endpoint. So in our case, it's going to be localhost 8080/API/message. And then it takes in some options. So first we're going to provide the method, which is going to be a post request. So before we do that, first let's define the body of the post request that we want to send. So I'm just going to define a variable called rec body, and it's just an object, and I'm just going to say sender is equal to sender, and content has the value of content. It's as simple as that. Inside this fetch request, what we're going to do now is we're going to have a body, and For that body, we're just going to say json.stringify and just the red body that we had defined earlier. And before we do that, we just need to specify some headers. So I'm going to add some headers, and this actually is an object, and inside here we will say content type is application /JSON, and we need a comma right over here. So remember that something that we added in server.js, passing in content type is a header that our server needs to allow, and now it will allow because we have that middleware there, and we are passing in the body that we have made up. And again, this returns a promise. So res, we are just going to define a callback function. Let me put this in parens so that it becomes a little more readable. And we're going to return the JSON version of the response. And with that JSON version of the response, what we can do is, for now, we can just log out the JSON version of the response. And this means that if we are able to see the JSON version of the response, then the message was successfully posted. Otherwise, we want to catch any errors that might have occurred along the way, and we want to log those errors out as well. Awesome. So we have a handle submit function inside our chat page.js, but we want to call it inside input container is when the user actually clicks the submit button. So the way we can pass down information is again through props, if you guys remember. And the way we can do that is just by saying, let's just call it handle submit only to make it easier for us to remember stuff. And within curly braces, we are just going to pass in this .handle submit. Again, I'm not calling the function here, I'm just passing it here. It's important to not have the parens. So I'm just passing the function down. Let's go to input container.js. Inside here, before I do this, what I can now do is I can just call this.props, and this is inside the handle submit function that we have defined inside input container.js. I can call in this.props handle submit, and this function expects two arguments, which are namely the name of the sender and the content of the message. So now we are basically calling the handle submit function that was defined in here, which takes in two arguments, the sender and content, and we are sending in this.state.sender, and we are sending in this.state.content to this function right over here, and this function will make the post request for us. So let's go back to the browser quickly, and let me quickly refresh the page. So let's see if everything is working or not. So let me provide my name, Zubin, and let's say hey there, and let me press enter. And we do get back a copy of the message. We are not seeing it right now because the request was already made and it's not real time yet. Don't worry, in the next tutorial we will make it real time. But if I refresh the page now, then I should see a copy of the message that was saved on the DB, and we are now able to get it back. All right, I think we are at a pretty good place with our front end. We have very nice and defined components, and we have a basic foundation ready to make our apps real time, which will happen in the next tutorial.